Part 1. The House That Stopped Breathing. 7 years. Not a few years. Not a long time. 7 years. 4 months. And 11 days since the last window in the monolith was opened from the inside. Arthur Greaves knew this, because he had written it down. He wrote everything down. The date the boiler was last serviced, the morning the salt air first cracked the north-facing concrete, the afternoon young Leo stopped answering to his own name. Arthur kept the ledger the way some men kept faith quietly, without expecting anyone to ask. The house stood on a basalt shelf above the Oregon coast. 3 stories of dark glass and poured concrete that Julian Vance had designed, that himself in the weeks after the search and rescue team stopped searching. Architects wrote about it in journals. They called it austere. They called it uncompromising. They called it a masterwork of emotional restraint. Arthur called it a mausoleum that still had people inside it. Julian had not designed a mausoleum. Of course. He had designed a fortress. There was a difference, though, from the outside. The view was roughly the same. The windows that faced the ocean were triple glazed and sealed with magnetic locks that required a code Julian had not used in 31 months. The hallways ran long and gray and lit by recessed panels that never flickered, never warmed, never changed. The kitchen had a professional range that cost more than most people's cars, and Arthur used it every morning to make breakfast for a man who ate standing up. Already reading something on a screen. Already somewhere else. Leo ate at the table. That was the rule. One rule survived in that house from before. Leo always ate at the table. The boy was 9 years old and had not spoken a single word in 7 years. The doctors had a name for it. Selective mutism, they said, originating in acute grief response. Compounded by environmental reinforcement, Julian had read every paper ever published on the subject. He had read them the way he read everything, completely, systematically, and without allowing any of it to touch him. Leo drew. That was the thing he did. He sat at the long library table by the sealed windows and cut paper into shapes. With a small pair of surgical scissors Arthur had found for him years ago, the shapes were always the same, at first buildings. Clean and geometric. The kind his father drew, but lately, and Arthur had noted this too, in his ledger, the shapes had been changing. A whale with wings. A lighthouse that had sprouted legs. A seagull made of interlocking gears. Arthur did not know what to make of this. He only knew it felt, faintly, like a question. The rain came in from the Pacific on a Tuesday in October. The kind that moved sideways and made the coast road genuinely dangerous. Arthur was at the window, a window he was allowed to open. In the east-facing utility room, the one Julian could not see from his studio when he noticed the headlights. A car that was not a delivery service. A car that parked badly. One wheel in the gravel, the other in the wet grass. As if the driver had made a decision quickly and was already second-guessing it. A woman got out. She had a canvas bag over one shoulder and a coat that was not quite waterproof. She stood in the rain for a moment, looking up at the house with an expression Arthur recognized immediately, because he had worn it himself once, the expression of a person calculating whether there was still time to leave. She did not leave. She walked to the front door and knocked. Not the way most people knocked on Julian Vance's door, tentatively, aware of who he was, but the way you knock when you are cold and the rain is inside your collar and dignity has become a secondary concern. Arthur opened the door. "Clara Finch," she said. For the library position, Arthur looked at her. She was young, late 20s, possibly 30. She had ink on her left hand and a small cut on her right thumb that she had wrapped in a piece of masking tape. The canvas bag, he could now see, was full of books. Not her books. Books she had brought as some kind of evidence. "Mr. Vance," Arthur said carefully, "does not typically conduct interviews in person." "I know," Clara said. His assistant said the same thing. And then she said the position had been open for 14 months, and perhaps an in-person visit would be acceptable. Arthur looked at her for a moment longer. "Come in," he said. The library occupied the entire second floor of the monolith's east wing, 4,000 square feet, of shelving that Elena Vance had begun collecting for years before she died, or disappeared, or whatever word was least wrong for what had happened to her on the night of the November storm 7 years ago. The books were in disorder. Not chaotic disorder. Julian would never have permitted that, but the careful disorder of a room that had been organized by someone and then not touched since, so that the organization itself had become a kind of fossil record. Elena's system. Elena's handwriting on the index cards. Elena's small paper flag still marking pages no one had read in 7 years. Clara walked in and stopped. She did not say anything about the dust. She did not make a sympathetic sound. She put her canvas bag down on the reading table, pulled out her notebook, and began walking the shelves the way a person walks a new piece of land methodically, touching spines, reading titles, making small marks on the page. Julian appeared in the doorway 6 minutes later. He was tall and angular, and he wore the particular expression of a man who has agreed to something he has already decided to refuse. He looked at Clara, the way he looked at structural assessments efficiently, expecting to find the problem quickly and move on. The collection needs recataloguing, Julian said. The current system is Dewey modified by collection date, Clara said, without looking up from the shelf, which is unusual but not wrong. Whoever did it was more interested in when things were acquired than what they were. A pause. My wife, Julian said. Clara turned around. She looked at him directly, the way people rarely looked at Julian Vance directly. It's a good system, she said. I'd keep it. Julian said nothing. The humidity is wrong in here, Clara said. She was already moving, already looking at the windows. For the older volumes, especially the paper, binding on that row of atlases is separating. You'd need a dehumidifier for winter, and she turned too quickly. Her elbow caught the edge of the architectural model on the center table, the model Julian had been working on for 3 weeks. A scale rendering of the Coastal Museum project in 3W.0. 100 individual components, and it went off the table. The sound it made hitting the floor was not loud. It was the specific sound of many small, careful things becoming wrong all at once. The room went very still. Arthur, watching from the hallway. I understood that this was the moment. Clara Finch would apologize. She would become small. She would offer to pay for it, which would be both impossible and insulting. And Julian would say something precise and cold. And she would leave. And the library position would remain open for another 14 months. Clara looked at the model on the floor. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a small wooden puppet, jointed, hand-painted, slightly battered. The kind of thing sold at craft markets or inherited from someone's grandmother. It had a little coat and a somewhat alarmed expression. She held the puppet up to the wreckage on the floor. Barnaby, she said, in a different voice, a puppet voice, serious and formal. I want you to take a good look at what you've done. She moved the puppet closer to the scattered components. Yes, she continued, as the puppet. I can see the bridge section has separated from the main promenade. That does seem like a problem. Do you have anything to say for yourself? She turned the puppet to look at her. I thought not. Julian stood in the doorway of his library in the house he had designed to contain his grief. And he watched a woman he had never met before conduct a formal inquiry, with a wooden puppet, into the destruction of 3 weeks of work. From behind the far shelf, from a space between the atlases and the maritime maps, to a space Arthur had not known Leo was occupying, came a sound. Short, unexpected, real, a laugh. Julian turned. Arthur turned. Leo was standing in the gap between the shelves with both hands pressed over his mouth, his eyes wide, as if he had startled himself. The room held its breath. Julian's face did something Arthur had not seen it do in a very long time. It did not become happy. Exactly. It became undone. Just slightly. The way a very tight knot shifts when one thread moves. Clara was looking at Leo now. She did not make the mistake most adults made. She did not make the moment large. She just nodded. Once. The way you acknowledge a colleague across a crowded room. Then she turned back to Julian. I'm sorry about the model, she said. I can work evenings to help rebuild it if that's useful. Though I suspect Barnaby should stay away from the table. Julian looked at her for a long moment. You're leaving, he said. It was not a question. It was the shape of what he expected. Clara picked up her bag. I assumed the interview was over. Julian's hand moved to the door, not to open it. He turned the key in the lock. Stay, he said. I want to understand why my son laughed when he looked at you. Arthur, in the hallway, opened his ledger to a fresh page. He wrote, asterisk, the first sound has come back. Asterisk, what is the one thing in your life you've been keeping perfectly preserved, and what would it mean? To finally let someone else touch it? Asterisk. Leave one word in the comments. Just one. The word that came to you when you read that question. And if this story feels like something worth following, the kind of quiet that asks you back, I know where the button is. No pressure. Only if it feels true. Part 2. The distance between almost and close. There are children who go quiet because they have nothing to say. And there are children who go quiet because the world never learned to hold still long enough to listen. Arthur had known Leo since the boy was 2 years old. He had watched him move through every stage of early childhood with the particular, alertness of a child who understood more than the adults around him wished he did. Leo had been the kind of small person who noticed when you were lying, not in an accusing way, in a quiet, patient way, as if he were simply filing the information somewhere for later. He stopped speaking 3 weeks after his mother's memorial service. Not immediately. Not dramatically. One morning he answered a question. The next morning he didn't. The morning after that, Julian was already on a call with the structural engineers in Rotterdam, and no one was asking questions that needed answering. And by the time anyone noticed, really noticed, not just registered the absence, Leo had been somewhere else for so long that the silence had its own gravity. Arthur had noted the date in his ledger, November 19th. 51 days after Elena's service. He had never shown Julian that entry. Some records were kept not to be read, but to be true. Clara Finch arrived the following Monday, with 3 boxes of conservation supplies, a wool cardigan, the color of old paper, and Barnaby tucked into the front pocket of her canvas bag like a very small passenger. She did not ask for a tour. She did not ask Julian any questions about the collection, about the system, about what he wanted from the restoration. She sat down at the reading table, opened the first box, and began working. Julian appeared in the doorway of the library twice that first morning. Both times he stood for a moment, watching, and then left without speaking. Clara did not appear to notice. Arthur, passing with a tray of coffee, suspected. She noticed everything. She talked while she worked. Not to Julian. Not to Arthur. Not even precisely to herself. She talked to Barnaby, propped against the spine of a large atlas at the corner of the table. In the low, continuous way some people talk to plants. This one's been through a flood at some point, she told him, carefully separating the pages of a water-damaged maritime survey. You can tell by the way the paper fused at the edges. Someone tried to dry it too fast. She paused. That's always the mistake. Too fast. From the far end of the library, behind a shelf of Pacific Coast navigational charts, nothing moved. Clara kept working. By the 3rd day, Leo was sitting on the floor, not near Clara, not obviously watching her. He had positioned himself in his usual space between the atlases and the north wall, with his surgical scissors and his paper, cutting the slow, careful shapes he always cut. But he had moved. Arthur measured it, with his eyes approximately 4 feet closer to the reading table than his usual spot. Clara did not comment on this. She told Barnaby about the sea. It was a thing she seemed to do when her hands were occupied. Narrate, in a low, factual voice, the story she was restoring. A ship's log from 1887. A crew that spent 11 weeks in fog so thick they navigated by the sound of other vessels' bells. A naturalist's field. Notes from 1923. A woman who had catalogued 47 species of 27 at Loder, coastal bird, and named each one after a philosopher. She named a pelican after Schopenhauer and Dodona Station. Clara said, which seems right. Honestly, pelicans have that look. From behind the navigational charts, a sound, almost not a sound, the faintest exhale through the nose. Clara did not look up. Arthur, refilling the coffee from the doorway, wrote one word in his ledger that evening. Asterisk, closer. By the 2nd week, Leo had begun to change his shapes. Arthur noticed it first. The cut paper accumulating at the edge of Leo's workspace had shifted. Still geometric. Still precise. But something had opened in them. A whale with enormous curving wings. The body built from 3 interlocking pieces. A lighthouse on legs. The legs articulated like a crab's. A seagull whose wings were made of tiny interlocking gears. Each tooth cut with the surgical scissors at a scale that should not have been possible for a 9-year-old's hands. Arthur placed one of them, the winged whale, on the reading table near Clara's supplies one evening. After Leo had gone to bed, he did not tell Clara where it had come from. The next morning, Clara arrived to find it on the table. She studied it for a long time. Then she set it carefully on the corner of the atlas, next to Barnaby, where it could be seen from the floor of the northwest shelf. She did not say anything about it. Leo arrived 20 minutes later. He went directly to his usual space. He looked, at the whale on the atlas corner. He sat down. He picked up his scissors. After a moment, he began cutting a new shape. Arthur, watching from the hallway, could not yet see what it would be. The storm came on a Wednesday night in late October. Moving in fast from the northwest, the kind Julian monitored from his studio on the upper floor, where the weather instruments were, where the sealed windows faced directly into the wind. The power went at 8:43. Arthur had candles. He always had candles. He moved through the house lighting them, the old practiced route he had learned in his first winter here. When the coastal storms came 4 times in a single month, and the backup generator had not yet been installed, the library went warm and amber. The shelves cast long shadows. The sealed windows held, as they always held, against the sound of the ocean below. Clara had been working late, a habit she had developed over the past 2 weeks. Staying past dinner, sometimes past 9, restoring the older volumes in the quiet hours when Julian was in his studio and Leo was in bed. Arthur had begun leaving a second cup of tea on the tray without being asked. Tonight she was not at the table. She was on the floor, in Leo's corner, cross-legged, with a small hinged wooden frame open in front of her, a miniature stage, 3 inches wide. With tiny curtains, she had clearly made herself from scraps of bookcloth. Barnaby stood behind it on a small dowel. 2 smaller figures new. Arthur now saw. Recently made stood beside him. Leo was sitting across from her, not close. The distance between them was still careful. Still his. But he was facing her, directly facing her, which was not something Arthur had seen him do with anyone in a very long time. Clara moved Barnaby to the center of the little stage. She made the puppet look at the 2 smaller figures. Then she began. The ship had been sailing for 40 days, she said. The puppet voice lower than her speaking voice, unhurried. And the captain, that's Barnaby? He won't tell you himself. The captain had forgotten which way was home. Not because he was lost, because he had decided that the ocean was safer than the harbor. Leo watched. Every night he sailed in a circle. Clara continued, moving Barnaby in a slow, deliberate arc behind the tiny curtain. The crew was very patient. They did not tell him he was going in circles. They only pointed out, when he asked for a heading, which star was north. She stopped. She turned the puppet to look at the 2 smaller figures beside it. One night, she said, something very small fell into the water. A paper crane. It had been folded by someone aboard, and it had gone over, in the side in the dark, and it was floating in the ocean. Which is a terrible place for a paper crane. She paused. Leo reached forward. He did not speak. He did not make a sound, but he reached forward and placed something at the edge of the miniature stage. A small cut paper shape, folded once. The corners precise. Not a crane, something between a whale and a bird. With the geared wings, Arthur had watched him cut over 3 evenings. His hand withdrew. The shape sat at the edge of the stage. Clara looked at it for a moment. She moved Barnaby forward. She had the puppet look at the shape carefully. The way the puppet always looked at things with that somewhat alarmed and very serious expression. Well, Barnaby said, that changes things entirely. Outside. The storm hit the glass. The candles leaned east and recovered. The amber light held. Julian Vance was standing in the doorway of the library. He had come down from his studio. Arthur did not know when. I did not know how long he had been there. He was standing very still, one hand on the door frame, looking at his son's profile in the candlelight, the focused face, the shape still placed at the edge of the puppet stage. He did not go in. He stood in the doorway for a long time, and he did not turn away. Arthur, watching from the far hallway, wrote in his ledger. Asterisk, he stayed. 2 words. That was all. Some entries only needed 2 words. Later, much later, when the storm had moved south, and the power had come back, and Leo was in bed with Barnaby on the shelf above him, Arthur brought Julian a glass of water in his studio. Julian was at his drafting table. He was not drawing anything. His hands were flat on the surface of the table, the way his hands sometimes sat when he was not yet ready to make a decision. She doesn't try to fix him, Julian said. Arthur waited. She just. Julian paused. He looked at his hands. She acts as if there's nothing to fix. Arthur set the glass down on the corner of the drafting table. He thought about the ledger entry he had written tonight. Asterisk. He stayed. Asterisk. He thought about the 51 days after Elena's service. He thought about the window in the east-facing utility room that he opened every morning. The one Julian could not see. Mr. Vance, Arthur said. Julian looked up. The ship in her story? The one going in circles? Arthur straightened the glass slightly on the table. It knew where north was the whole time. He left the studio. He did not wait for a response. Some truths were only useful if you let the listener find them on their own. Asterisk. Is there someone in your life who never tried to fix you? And do you understand, now, what that cost them? Asterisk. Leave 1 word. The one that came to you just now. Just one. Part 3. The man who could build anything except a way back. A man can design a bunker that will survive the end of the world. He can calculate load tolerances for a structure that will outlast every person who ever stood Inside it, he can specify the exact thickness of glass that will hold against a Category 5 wind. He can model the precise angle at which a roof must slope so that water never pools, never penetrates, never finds a way in. What they do not teach you, in any school of architecture, in any professional certification, in any of the 47 awards Julian Vance had received in 17 years, is how to hold your own child. Arthur had watched him try. In the early months, before the silence became permanent, before Leo's stillness settled into something structural, Julian had tried. He had stood in doorways. He had sat at the edge of beds. He had placed his hand, on Leo's shoulder, and Leo had not pulled away. And Julian had held the touch for 4 seconds and then that removed it because he did not know what to do next. 4 seconds. Arthur had not written that in the ledger. Some things were too precise to survive being written down. Clara had been at the Monolith for 3 weeks when Julian began watching her through the security monitors. He would not have called it watching. He would have called it review the same way he reviewed structural assessments or weather projections. Methodically, briefly. As part of the management of a large and complex property, he checked the camera in the library twice a day. Then, 3 times. Then he left it open in the corner of his secondary screen. He told himself this was because of Leo, because of the unprecedented fact of Leo placing a frosette paper shape on a stranger's puppet stage in the dark, because any responsible parent would want to understand the mechanism of that. The mechanism, as far as Julian could determine, was incomprehensible. Clara did nothing that should have worked. She did not use the therapeutic techniques the specialists in Portland had recommended. She did not maintain careful emotional distance. She did not follow any protocol Julian had found in any of the literature. She talked to a wooden puppet about the migratory patterns of Pacific albatross. She held water-damaged books the way other people held injured animals. She laughed at things that were not particularly funny, not loudly, not performatively, but in the short, honest way of someone who finds the world genuinely strange and is comfortable with that. On the monitor, Julian watched her hold a 19th century tide chart up to the window, the east-facing window. The one Arthur opened and traced the depth markings with her finger, as if she were reading a letter from someone she had never met but recognized immediately. He watched and did not understand what he was watching. He closed the feed. He opened it again 11 minutes later. The windows were the first problem. Clara had begun opening them. Not the sealed ones, not the magnetic locked triple-glazed panels that faced the ocean. The ones Julian had not touched in 31 months. But the secondary windows, the east-facing panels in the library that required only a handle turn, the tall, narrow window at the end of the upstairs corridor, the small frosted glass vent above the kitchen sink that had been painted shut for 2 winters, and that Clara had apparently freed with a palette knife and a frankly unreasonable amount of determination. The salt air came in. Julian noticed it first on the stairs, a thread of cold ocean that had no business being inside this building. Moving through the hallway as if it had been invited, he found Clara in the library with the east window fully open. 3 inches of November Pacific air moving over the reading table, lifting the corner of a tissue paper restoration sheet. That window, Julian said, stays closed. Clara looked at the window. She looked at Julian. The humidity in here is still 4 points too high for the older bindings. The mechanical dehumidifier is addressing the average, but the pockets near the north wall need air movement, or the vellum section will. The window stays closed. A pause. Clara held the tissue paper flat with 2 fingers. All right, she said. She closed the window. Julian stood there for a moment, aware that he had won something that did not feel like a victory, and left. The following morning, the window was open again. 1 inch. Precisely 1 inch. Which was, Clara had apparently calculated, the minimum aperture required for adequate air circulation, without creating a draft that would disturb the tissue paper. Julian looked at the 1-inch opening for a long time. He did not close it. The flowers appeared on a Thursday. Not arranged flowers. Not anything purchased. A handful of things Clara had apparently gathered from the slope below the property sea thrift. Still faintly pink. In November. And something yellow and low that grew in the rock crevices placed in a wide-mouthed mason jar on the hallway table outside the library. The hallway table had held, for 7 years, a specific object, a scale model of a building Julian had completed in 2019. Clean and architectural. Positioned there because Elena had asked for something on that table. And this was what Julian had put there, and it had not moved since. Clara had moved it. Not removed it. Moved it 18 inches to the left to make room for the mason jar, which now stood in the center of the table and made the entire hallway smell. Faintly. Like the cliff outside. Julian stood in front of this arrangement for a full minute. He moved the model back to the center. Clara moved it again the next day. Same 18 inches. No, come on. Julian moved it back. This continued for 4 days. Arthur watched it with the focused attention of a man, observing a very slow and very important negotiation. On the 5th day, Julian walked past the table and did not move the model. He did not know why. He was in a hurry. He had a call with the Rotterdam office. He was already thinking about something else. Arthur noted it in the ledger without comment. The lighthouse had been locked for 7 years, 3 months, and 4 days. It stood at the north end of the property, connected to the house by a covered walkway that Julian had sealed with a keypad he had programmed himself in the weeks after the search was called off. 12 digits. A sequence he had chosen because he would never accidentally type it. Not a birthday, not an anniversary, not any number that might arise in the course of normal life and catch him off guard. He stood in front of the keypad sometimes. Not often. Not on a schedule. But there were evenings, particularly in the fall when the weather moved in, hard from the northwest, and the light faded early. When he found himself at the end of the covered walkway with his hand near the pad, he had never entered the code. His hand would hover. His fingers would locate the first digit. And then, something in him, not fear exactly. Not resistance. Exactly. Something more like the knowledge of what was on the other side of that door and what I would require to survive. Being on the other side of that door would pull his hand back. He would stand for a moment. Then he would walk back to the house. Clara found him there on a Tuesday evening in November. The wind off the ocean cold enough to make the covered walkway hum. She was carrying 2 mugs of tea. Arthur had made it. Julian understood this later. I understood that Arthur had seen him leave the house and had sent Clara after him with a tray, which was an interference Julian would have to address, and would not, because the tea was very hot and the walkway was very MFX, cold, and Clara held out the mug without speaking. They stood for a moment, facing the keypad door. "You don't have to tell me," Clara said. Julian wrapped both hands around the mug. "Elena was doing research here," he said. The words came out more directly than he intended, without his usual architecture of deflection he had built around them. Ocean acoustics. She'd been working with a marine biology team for 3 years. She was cataloging the sound signatures of the deep current that runs along this shelf, the way the water moves below the storm layer. He stopped. "The night of the storm," he said. "She came out here to check the equipment. The recording instruments she'd been running for 11 months. Clara held her mug. "They found the door open," Julian said. "That's all. The door open and the equipment running and the recordings going. Nothing else." The wind moved through the walkway. The keypad light blinked at steady green. "She loved this building," Julian said. Not to Clara. To the door. She said it was the only place on the coast where you could hear the deep water. Below the storm, she said if you stood in the right place inside, when the wind was coming from the north, you could hear something that sounded almost like... He stopped himself. "Music," Clara said. Julian looked at her. "That's what you were going to say," Clara said. "Isn't it?" He looked back at the door. His hand did not move toward the keypad. "The thing holding you under?" Clara said, her voice low and even. "Might not be the ocean. It might be the room you've locked yourself inside." Julian stood with his mug in both hands in the cold covered walkway for a long time. He did not open the door, but he stood there longer than he ever had before. And when he finally turned to walk back to the house, he did not put his hands in his pockets the way he usually did, arms in, shoulders up, the body making itself smaller against the cold. He walked with his hands at his sides. It was a small thing. Arthur, watching from the kitchen window, I thought it was possibly the most important thing he had seen in 7 years. That night, at 11:41, the alarm system in the lighthouse powered on. Not the security alarm. The equipment alarm, the monitoring system Elena had installed for the recording instruments, which ran on a separate circuit that Julian had never disconnected, because disconnecting it would have required going inside. It had not triggered in 7 years. 3 months. And 4 days. It ran for 30 seconds. Then it went quiet. Arthur wrote in his ledger, "Asterisk. Something inside is still running. Asterisk. What is the thing you keep standing in front of the door you return to without opening, and what do you think is actually on the other side? Asterisk. Leave one word. The one that lives in that space. Just one." Part 4. The woman who arrived with lawyers. The black SUV came on a Friday morning. Before the fog had lifted, Arthur saw it from the kitchen window at 7:52, a vehicle that moved with the particular confidence of something that had already decided the outcome of its visit. It parked directly in front of the main entrance, which no one did. because the main entrance had a gravel apron designed for approach from the side. Parking directly in front required either ignorance of a layout or a deliberate statement about whose property this was. Arthur recognized the statement. He had seen Evelyn Marsh exactly 3 times in 7 years. Once at Elena's memorial service, where she had stood at the center of the room and accepted condolences as if she were the one being mourned. Once the following spring, when she had arrived with a child psychologist and a manila folder, and sat across from Julian in the kitchen, and explained, in the careful language of genuine concern, that Leo's silence was becoming a liability. And once 2 years after that, a brief and technical visit regarding the terms of Elena's estate, which had concluded with Evelyn writing a number on a piece of paper and sliding it across the table and Julian not picking it up. She stepped out of the SUV now in a coat that cost more than Clara Finch's monthly rent, followed by a man with a briefcase and a woman with a tablet and a second man with a briefcase. 4 people. Arthur counted them the way he counted everything precisely, without judgment. And with a clear understanding of what the count meant, he put the kettle on. Then he went to find Julian. Evelyn Marsh was 53 years old and had spent 26 of those years being the elder sister of the most luminous person in any room. She had learned, in that time, a particular skill. She had learned to identify, very quickly, the thing that was most important to someone, and to locate herself in relation to it. The most important thing to Julian Vance, for 7 years, had been Leo's safety. Evelyn understood safety as a concept she could define better than Julian could. Being in possession of lawyers and institutional credibility, and a 5-bedroom house in Seattle with an excellent school district and a network of specialists who owed her favors, she had not come to harm anyone. She was certain of this. She had come, as she always came, because she was right. Julian received her in the front room, not the kitchen, which was Clara's territory now, in some way he hadn't examined, and not his studio, which was his. The front room was neutral ground. It had chairs that were expensive and uncomfortable and a view of the cliff that reminded everyone present of the relevant facts. Evelyn sat down. Her lawyer opened his briefcase. Her second lawyer opened her tablet. I've had someone review Leo's case file, Evelyn said. She did not preface this. She did not ask how he was orting. The specialist in Boston, the one I mentioned in March, has a residential program opening in January. 12 children. Structured environment. Intensive communication therapy. Peer interaction that Leo doesn't currently have access to. Julian looked at the view. No. Julian. No. Evelyn placed a photograph on the coffee table. Arthur, standing at the doorway with a tray no one had asked for, recognized it immediately. Leo on the rocks below the property. Clara beside him. Both of them looking at something in a tidal pool. The afternoon 2 weeks ago when the weather had briefly cleared. A woman you hired 6 weeks ago, Evelyn said, is taking my nephew onto an exposed coastal shelf in November. It was 52 degrees. Julian said. The tide was out. She has no certifications in child development, no therapeutic training, no background in... She has Leo laughing. The words came out of Julian without preparation, without the usual architecture. They landed in the room and sat there. Evelyn paused. Her lawyer's pen stopped moving. I've spoken to 3 specialists about selective mutism in the past 7 years, Julian said. His voice was level. I have read every paper published on the subject in the past decade. I have had 8 therapists, 4 child psychologists, and 1 specialist flown in from Johns Hopkins, sit in this house and work with my son. He looked at his sister-in-law. None of them made him laugh. Evelyn looked at the photograph. Then she looked at Julian. She's an unqualified young woman who repairs old books, Evelyn said, who has, in 6 weeks, made herself indispensable to a grieving child, and a man who, she stopped. She chose her next words with visible care. A man who is lonely. The room was quiet. Julian did not respond to the word lonely. He did not confirm or deny it. He looked at it the way you look at a correctly aimed thing. The program in Boston, Evelyn said, more gently now. Julian. Leo is 9 years old. He has not spoken in 7 years. The window for... There is no window, Julian said. He is not a project with a deadline. Evelyn placed a second document on the table. Arthur saw the letterhead from where he stood. Legal. Heavy paper. The kind of document that had been prepared before the conversation began. I have petitioned for temporary guardianship review, Evelyn said. Not because I want to take Leo from you. Because I believe you need a formal assessment of his current situation, and the court will require... You've already filed. I filed the preliminary notice on Wednesday. The room held its weight. Julian looked at the document on the table. He did not pick it up. The hearing, Evelyn said, is set for Monday week. If you want to avoid it proceeding, you'll need to. She paused. The museum project. Elena's foundation holds the cultural designation for the coastal site. I sit on the board. If you are willing to transfer project management to a neutral firm and agree to a temporary supervision arrangement for Leo's care, I can recommend to the board that the petition be withdrawn. Arthur set the tray down on the side table very carefully so that the cups did not make a sound. You want the museum? Julian said. I want Leo to have proper care. You want the museum? Julian said again. And you want the woman who repairs old books out of this house. Evelyn did not deny this. She had learned, in 53 years, that there was a kind of credibility in not denying things. The hearing is Monday week, she said. She stood. Her lawyers stood. Think carefully. Julian, about what is best for your son. She left. The SUV backed out of the main entrance with the same certainty with which it had arrived. Julian sat in the front room for a long time without moving. Clara had been in the library during the entire meeting. She had not been listening. She had been working, restoring the binding on a 1,931 coastal survey, and the front room was on the opposite side of the house. She heard nothing. She heard it later. In the evening, she had stayed past dinner, as she often did now, and was coming down from the second floor with a box of supplies, when she heard Evelyn's lawyer's voice from the garden passage low, professional, the tone of someone summarizing a meeting for the record. She heard her own name. She heard the phrase, times remove the variable. She heard. Asterisk, once the girl is gone, we have the child. Clara stood in the passage with the box of supplies and the 1,931 coastal survey she had been carrying tucked under her arm. And she was very still. She thought about Leo on the rocks. The afternoon 2 weeks ago. The way he had pointed without touching. Without speaking. But pointed at something small and brown moving in the tidal pool. And looked at her with an expression that was unmistakably the expression of someone sharing something they loved. She thought about Barnaby on the puppet stage in the candlelight. She thought about the paper shape at the edge of the miniature curtain. She set the box of supplies down on the passage floor, very carefully, and stood there in the dark for a long time. Arthur found her there 10 minutes later. She was not crying. She was just standing, the coastal survey still tucked under her arm, looking at nothing in particular. You heard, Arthur said. Clara looked at him. She's not entirely wrong, she said. About me. I don't have credentials. I repair books. I'm nobody's idea of a qualified Miss Finch, Arthur said. She stopped. Arthur had been in this house for 11 years. He had watched Elena fill it with light and sound, and the particular Elena fill it with light and sound, warm disorder of a person who believed houses were for living in. He had watched Julian seal it up after her, room by room, window by window, like a man bricking himself into a monument. He had watched Leo go quiet and stay quiet, and build his paper shapes in the corner. He had watched, in 6 weeks, something begin to move. In 11 years, Arthur said, I have seen 12 people come through this house to help that child. He looked at her steadily. You are the first one he has offered something to? Clara was quiet. The paper shape, Arthur said. On the stage, in the dark, Clara looked down at the coastal survey under her arm. That is not nothing, Arthur said. Whatever anyone calls it. He picked up her box of supplies from the floor and carried it back toward the library. Clara stood in the passage for another moment. Then she followed him. Asterisk. Have you ever been called the wrong word for a thing you knew was true, and how long did it take? If you just stop believing the wrong word? Asterisk. Leave one word. The one they used. Or the one you use for yourself now. Just one. Part 5. The ones who leave quietly love you the most. The storm came in from the northwest on a Saturday night, in the same direction they always came from on this stretch of coast. As if the Pacific had one opinion, and held it consistently, Clara had known since Thursday that she would leave. Not because Evelyn had frightened her. Not because of the lawyers or the petition or the phrase, remove the variable spoken, in a garden passage by a man who did not know she was standing 12 feet away. She had held those things, and turned them over and understood them, for what they were, not a threat to her, but a weight placed on Julian at the exact moment when he had just, for the first time in 7 years, begun to put something down. If she stayed, Evelyn had the hearing. The hearing meant Julian's history in the public record. The depression, the sealed rooms, the child who did not speak, all of it rendered in the language of legal risk, which was the language that made ordinary grief look like negligence. If she left, Evelyn had nothing. No variable. No case. No evidence of disruption. Julian kept the museum. Julian kept Leo. Leo kept the paper shapes, and the tidal pools, and the puppet stage in the dark. It was a clean logic. Clara had always been good at clean logic. She did not let herself think too carefully about the other side of it. She packed on Saturday evening while the storm was still offshore, and the wind picking up in long pulls that made the east window, the one she had argued 1 inch open every morning for 5 weeks, rattle in its frame. She did not pack much. The conservation supplies were not hers. The books were not hers. The mason jar on the hallway table was not hers. She packed the things she had come with: the cardigan the color of old paper, the notebook with the shelf assessments, the canvas bag. Barnaby, she placed on Leo's shelf. She did it carefully, not tucking him against the wall where he might be missed, but standing him upright at the front of the shelf, facing the room, the somewhat alarmed expression forward. The way she had always positioned him on the puppet stage when he was meant to be paying attention. She stood in the doorway of Leo's room for a moment. Leo was asleep, one arm out from under the blanket, his surgical scissors on the nightstand where he always left them. On the floor beside his bed, 3 paper shapes she had not seen before. A lighthouse, a figure na coet, a bird with geared wings, larger than the ones he had made before, the detail finer, the gears interlocking with a precision that should not have been possible in paper. Clara looked at the bird for a long time. Then she went to Julian's studio. She did not go in. He was not there. His drafting table was lit but empty, which meant he was somewhere in the house she didn't know, doing the late-night thinking he did when the storm weather came in. She left the folded paper on the drafting table where he would find it. She had made it herself. That afternoon. Cut paper. Her paper. Not Leo's 3 figures standing inside a lighthouse that was lit from within. The light came from a cut she had made with a single clean stroke through the center, so that when you held it up to any source of illumination, the whole structure glowed. She had not written anything on it. There was nothing she could have written that would not have been the wrong size for what she meant. She walked down the stairs. She picked up her canvas bag. She opened the front door. The storm hit her immediately cold and lateral external, the kind of rain that finds the gaps in a coat in under a minute. She pulled the door closed behind her, gently, so it did not wake anyone, and walked to her car. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment with her hands on the wheel. She did not look back at the house. She drove. The front door. Arthur heard it, the particular sound of the latch engaging, which he knew the way you know the sounds of a house you've lived in for 11 years. Not a slam. Not a pull. The sound of someone being careful not to be heard. He got up. He found the library in the condition she had left it, tools on the table, the 1,931 coastal survey in its repair cradle, the east window open its single inch, the mason jar still on the hallway table with the sea thrift, still faintly pink. Everything in order. Everything placed as if she intended to return to it. He found Leo's room. He saw Barnaby on the shelf, facing forward. He found the drafting table. He found the cut paper lighthouse. 3 figures inside. And he held it up to the drafting light and watched it glow. He stood there for a long time. Then he closed his eyes briefly, not dramatically, not for any reason that would have been visible to anyone watching, and went to find Julian. Julian was in the covered walkway. He stood at the end, near the lighthouse keypad, as he sometimes stood in the storm weather, one hand near the panel, not touching it, just near it. In the way you stand near a door, you are learning to consider. He was already turning when Arthur appeared at the walkway entrance. He saw Arthur's face. "Where?" Julian said. "She's gone." Arthur said. Sometime in the last hour, Julian was already moving back through the walkway, through the house, up the stairs. Arthur followed. Julian went to Leo's room first. Not his studio. Not the library, Leo's room, which was where Arthur would have gone too, because that was where you would know. He saw Barnaby on the shelf. He stood in the doorway of his son's room at 2 in the morning with the storm against the windows. And he understood, immediately, and completely, what Barnaby standing on the front of the shelf meant. Not tucked away, not left as an afterthought, left as a promise. He looked at the floor. He saw the 3 paper shapes, the lighthouse, the figure in the coat, the bird with the geared wings. Then Leo moved. Not awake, not fully. A child's half-consciousness in a storm. Some animal awareness of something changed in the air of the room. He turned. He reached instinctively for the nightstand, for the scissors. The way you reach for the specific gravity of a known object. His hand found Barnaby instead. He opened his eyes. He looked at Barnaby. He looked at the shelf. He looked at Julian in the doorway. His face went through something Arthur could not have catalogued. Not one thing. Not a sequence of things. But a movement. like the surface of water when something large passes under it. He sat up slowly. He looked at Julian. He looked at Barnaby again. He understood. The sound that came out of Leo was not quiet. It was not the careful exhale from behind the navigational charts, or the brief suppressed thing from behind the library shelf. It was open and ragged and came from somewhere that had been sealed for 7 years. And it broke over the room like a wave breaking over basalt. He was crying. Not the crying of a child distressed in a manageable way, the crying of someone whose body had remembered, all at once, that this was something it was allowed to do. Julian crossed the room. He sat on the edge of the bed. He put his arms around his son. 4 seconds. 7 years ago. In the early months, when he had not known what to do next, he knew now. He held on. Leo pressed his face into Julian's shoulder. The paper bird still clutched in one hand, and the sound that came from him was enormous and real and alive, the Phasian sound of a house that had been holding its breath for 7 years, 4 months, and 11 days. Finally letting go, the storm hit the windows. Arthur stood in the hallway and did not go in. Some rooms, at certain moment, were not meant to have witnesses. Then Leo pulled back. He looked at Julian's face. His own face was completely open, all the careful geometry gone. Just a 9-year-old boy in the dark with his father. He opened his mouth. The words came out rough and hoarse, as if they had been stored somewhere that did not quite fit them anymore. Somewhere too small for what they had grown into. "Don't let her disappear," he said. Like Mom. Julian's face did something Arthur had no word for. He pressed his forehead to his son's. He held him for a long time without speaking. Then he straightened. He looked at Leo with an expression that was completely clear. "Stay here," he said. He walked out of the room. He walked down the hall. He picked up his keys from the hook by the kitchen door, not his own keys. Not the key fob for the car. He drove to the Rotterdam meetings, but the spare set, the old ones. The ring with the lighthouse key he had never removed. He walked to the front door. Arthur was already there. He held out Julian's coat. "Portland," Arthur said. "If she left an hour ago in this weather, she'll be on the coast road. She won't make the freeway junction until—" "I know," Julian said. He put the coat on. He went out into the storm. Arthur closed the front door. He stood in the hallway for a moment. The mason jar with the sea thrift on the table beside him. The hallway full of the smell of the cliff. He went back to Leo's room. Leo was sitting on his bed with Barnaby in his lap. The paper bird beside him. Waiting. "Your father," Arthur said, "is going to go find her." Leo looked at him. His eyes were still bright from crying. His face still open. All the silence stripped away. He nodded. Once. The nod of someone who has decided to believe something. Arthur sat down in the chair by the window and kept him company until morning. Asterisk. Have you ever stayed silent to protect someone? And did they ever know? Asterisk. Leave one word in the comments. The one that lives in that question for you. And if this story has found its way into something you recognize, if this house feels like somewhere you've stood before, you already know where to find the next part. The door's open. It always was. Part 6. What the lighthouse had been keeping. One sentence from a child can dismantle what 7 years of architecture could not. Julian drove the coast road in the storm with both hands on the wheel, and his son's voice still, running through him like a current through a grounded wire. Don't let her disappear. Like Mom. 7 words. The first 7 words in 7 years. And every single one of them had landed in a different room of the structure he had spent 7 years building inside himself. And the whole thing had come apart the way things come apart when they were only held together by the belief that they were solid. He drove 40 miles before his phone rang. Arthur. He answered it through the car speakers. She stopped. Arthur said, I checked her emergency contact form when she was hired. Her sister lives in Tillamook. There's one place Clara would stop in a storm this heavy before the mating. Junction, the overnight lot at the Rockaway Beach Visitor Center. 18 miles south. Julian drove. He found her car in the lot, the only car. A 15-year-old Subaru with a university parking permit faded to near illegibility on the rear window and a small ceramic lighthouse on the dashboard that he had not noticed the night she arrived. The engine was off. The windows were fogged from the inside. He parked beside her. He sat for a moment. Then he got out into the rain. He knocked on the passenger window. Not loudly. Not the knock of someone certain of their welcome. A pause. Then the window came down 2 inches. Julian, Clara said. Her voice was careful and composed in the way voices are careful and composed when a person has been sitting alone in a fogged car for 40 minutes, making sure they are all right. Leo spoke. Julian said. The window came down the rest of the way. Clara looked at him. The rain was coming down sideways, and Julian was not using his coat as any kind of shelter from it. He was just standing in it. The way people stand in things when they have stopped calculating the cost. He spoke. She said. 7 words. Julian said. The first 7 words in 7 years. Clara was very still. He asked me not to let you disappear. Julian said. He stopped. He looked at the ceramic lighthouse on her dashboard. Like his mother? The rain ran down the windows, and the parking lot was empty in every direction, and the Pacific was somewhere beyond the dunes, making its consistent argument against the shore. Get in the car. Clara said. You're soaking. I'm not. Julian. Get in the car. He got in the car. They sat in the fogged Subaru for a long time. The rain on the roof loud and even. The ceramic lighthouse between them. On the dashboard, catching the parking lot light. She's not wrong, Clara said. After a while. Evain. About the credentials. About what I am. I know what you are. Julian said. You know what I've done for 6 weeks in your library? That's not the same as, you made my son laugh. Julian said. Then you made him come closer. Then you made him reach across a room and put something of his own on a stage that belonged to someone else. He looked at the dashboard. Then he gave you a paper bird he spent 3 days making, and you didn't even know it was for you. Clara turned her head. What? The bird with the gears, Julian said. The one on the floor by his bed? He started it the day after the storm. After the puppet stage. He worked on it for 3 evenings. I watched him on the security camera. A pause. I watched the library camera more than I should. Clara was quiet for a moment. He left it on the floor. She said. He didn't know how to give it to you. Julian said. He's 9. He's never given anyone anything before. The rain shifted direction slightly. The windows fogged further. I left Barnaby on his shelf. Clara said. I know. He found it in the dark. Julian's hands were flat on his knees. The way they sat on his drafting table when he was not yet ready to decide something, except now they were still. Not from hesitation, but from the specific stillness of a person who has already decided and is waiting for the words to form in the right order. He was holding the puppet when he spoke. His first words in 7 years were spoken into a wooden puppet's ear. Something moved across Clara's face. Not a smile. Exactly. Closer to a recognition. Barnaby's very easy to talk to. She said. Apparently. A pause. The rain. The lighthouse on the dashboard. Evelyn files Monday week. Clara said. If I come back. If you come back? Julian said. I will deal with Evelyn. How? Julian was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm going to open the lighthouse. Clara turned to look at him. Tonight, he said. When we get back, I'm going to go in. He looked at the rain on the windshield, the water moving in long, irregular lines down the glass. I should have gone in years ago. I knew that. He stopped. He chose the next words carefully. The way he chose measurements, the things I was afraid to find, were exactly the things I needed. I understood that in the abstract, I could not make my hand move on the keypad. What changed? Clara said. Julian looked at her. You said the room, he said. Not the ocean. The room I'd locked myself inside? He paused. I've been standing at that keypad for 7 years, thinking I was afraid of what Elena left behind. But what I was actually afraid of was going inside and discovering that she had left something for me, because if there was something there meant for me, then I had spent 7 years not opening the door. And I would have to. He stopped. Live with that, Clara said. Yes. The parking lot was very quiet around the rain. She did leave something, Clara said. Not a question. I don't know, Julian said. I haven't gone in. But you know. A long pause. Yes, Julian said. I know. They drove back to the Monolith in their separate cars, Clara following Julian's taillights up the coast road. In the storm beginning to move south, as storms on this coast always eventually moved south. Arthur was at the door when they arrived. He looked at Clara's canvas bag. He looked at Julian. He did not say anything. He stepped aside and held the door. And the hall light fell across the sea thrift in the mason jar, still faintly pink. And Clara walked into the house that smelled like the cliff. Leo was sitting at the top of the stairs with Barnaby. He was not asleep. He was sitting very straight, the puppet in his lap, watching the front door with the focused patience of a child who has decided to wait and has committed to it completely. When he saw Clara, something in his face resolved, not relief. Exactly. Because relief implies uncertainty. And Leo's expression was the expression of someone who had known this was how it would go and was simply confirming it. He stood up. He walked down 4 stairs. He held out Barnaby. Not offering him, Clara had left the puppet on his shelf deliberately. And he knew that. And she knew he knew that. He held Barnaby out the way you hold out your hand when you want to walk somewhere together. Clara went up 4 stairs. She took the puppet's hand, the small, jointed wooden hand between her thumb and finger. Leo looked at her. Then he looked at Julian. Then he went back upstairs to bed. Barnaby trailing between them, like a small ambassador who had completed his mission. Arthur made tea. Julian went to the lighthouse at 1 in the morning. After Leo was asleep, and the storm had moved past, and the coast was doing the thing it did after storms, the particular stillness of a place that has just been thoroughly rearranged and is now considering itself. He went alone. This was right. Clara had said it without saying it. Standing at the kitchen table, her hands around her mug, not moving toward the covered walkway, not offering to come. Some doors had to be opened by the person who had closed them. The keypad light blinked green in the dark. Julian stood in front of it. He thought about the first measurement he had ever taken on this property 17 years ago. Before Leo. Before the sealed rooms. Before the 7 years and 4 months and 11 days. He had stood on this basalt shelf with a transit level and looked out at the Pacific and understood, for the first time, that the scale of what he built was not its own defense, that you could build something that would outlast you and still not have anything to stand behind. He thought about Leo's voice. The specific roughness of it, the way it had moved through the house like water, through a crack in a sealed wall, not damaging anything. Just finding its way. He entered the code. 12 digits. The sequence he had chosen because he would never accidentally type it. The lock released. He opened the door. The lighthouse was cold and still, and completely undisturbed. Elena had been meticulous, the equipment covered with cloth, the research materials filed in labeled boxes, the instruments in their cases, everything exactly as she had left it, which meant everything exactly as she had intended it to be found. He stood in the center of the round room and turned slowly. There were recording reels, 11 months of ocean acoustics, labeled in her handwriting dates, depths, weather conditions, the specific notation system she had developed herself. There were notebooks. There were the photographs she had pinned above the work table, not of the family, or not primarily photographs of the water. The deep current signatures she had been mapping, the places where the shelf dropped away and something else took over, and on the table, under a glass paperweight that held a piece of sea glass, the particular blue-green of deep water, was an envelope. His name? Her handwriting. Present tense. Not Julian Vance. Not Mr. Vance. Not any formal distance. Just Julian. He stood with the envelope in his hands for a long time. Then he sat down in her chair and opened it. He read it slowly. He read it twice. The third time he could not read it because of what had happened to his vision. But by then he had the words already. And they were inside him. And they were the size of the thing he had been afraid they would be. She had written, "If you are reading this, you came back. That is the only thing I ever needed to know." She had written about Leo, about the lighthouse, and what she had hoped it would become a place for children along this stretch of coast. She had the plans already drawn. She had been talking to the marine biology department. There was a grant she had applied for. She had wanted to tell him, but the project was not yet ready, and she had wanted to present it whole. She had written, "Asterisk, don't keep the house as an ending. It was always meant to be a beginning." She had written, near the bottom, in the slightly different ink that meant she had returned to the letter on a different day, "Asterisk, you are not good at being alone. You have never been good at being alone. I have always loved this about you, and I am sorry I could not stay to keep you company. Find someone who makes the rooms feel inhabited. Don't lock the windows." Julian sat in Elena's chair in the lighthouse she had loved, with the letter in his hands and the coast quiet outside. And he was not a man who designed fortresses. He was just a man who missed his wife and loved his son, and had, somehow, in 6 weeks, allowed a woman with a wooden puppet and a 1-inch window to reach into the sealed interior of his life and leave the lights on. He sat there until the sky began to go gray. Then he went inside and found Arthur in the kitchen at his usual post, the kettle already on. She left plans, Julian said, for the lighthouse, for what she wanted it to become. Arthur placed the mug on the counter. She wanted it to be a place for children, Julian said. Coastal kids. She had a grant application. A marine biology partnership. He stopped. She had been working on it for years. Right here, in the room I wouldn't go into. Arthur was quiet. She wrote that I am not good at being alone. Julian said. No. Arthur said. You are not. Julian looked at the mug. She said, don't lock the windows. Arthur looked at the east-facing window above the kitchen sink, the one Clara had freed with a palette knife, the one that had been painted shut for 2 winters. Open now. A thin line of gray morning air coming through. Miss Finch, Arthur said. Opened that one on her 4th day. Julian picked up the mug. I know, he said. Asterisk. Is there something someone left for you, a letter? A room. A choice they made on your behalf that you haven't been able to open yet? Asterisk. Leave one word. The one that lives in whatever you haven't opened. Just one. Part 7. The man who brought a puppet to $100 million room. There is a specific silence that falls over a room full of powerful people when someone does something they cannot categorize. It is not the silence of disapproval. It is not the silence of discomfort. It is the silence of an audience that is prepared for one kind of performance and found itself watching something else entirely, something they did not know they had been waiting for. The Coastal Heritage Foundation Gala occupied the Grand Ballroom of the Sentinel Hotel in Seattle on the 2nd Friday of November. 312 people in a room designed to make 312 people feel the appropriate weight of consequence. The project on the table was the most significant cultural commission on the Pacific Northwest coast in 40 years, a museum of ocean science and maritime history to be built on the basalt shelf above the Oregon coast, adjacent to a property that already had the structural foundations in place. Everyone in the room knew who was going to win the commission. Julian Vance had designed 6 of the last 8 major coastal cultural sites in the country. His firm held 3 of the patents on the structural innovations the museum would require. He had been involved in the preliminary site assessment for 11 months. The question was not whether he would win. The question was which version of his presentation they would to be discussing in the architecture journals for the next decade. He was the last presenter of the evening. He walked to the podium at 9:47 with a canvas bag over one shoulder, not a portfolio case, not a presentation tablet, a canvas bag, old, slightly worn, the kind that had been used regularly for a long time, for purposes it had been designed for. He set it on the podium. He reached into it. He placed 3 things on the podium surface. First, a small wooden puppet with a jointed coat and a somewhat alarmed expression. Second, a collection of paper shapes a whale with wings, a lighthouse on legs, a bird with interlocking gears, a figure na quat, 2 smaller figures standing close together. Third, a cut paper construction, 3 figures inside a lighthouse. The interior cut clean, so that the ballroom light came through the center, and the whole thing glowed. The room went very quiet. Julian looked at the 312 people. My son, he said. He did not speak for 7 years, 4 months, and 11 days. He let that sit. I want to tell you what it sounds like when a child who hasn't spoken in 7 years finds his voice in the dark during a storm. It sounds like a house, remembering it's a house. It sounds like a door opening that you had forgotten was a door. He paused. It doesn't sound like anything you can design for. I've been trying to design for it for 7 years. And I can tell you with professional certainty you cannot. Engineer your way to the moment when something sealed comes open. He picked up the winged whale. He held it up. My son made this. He's 9 years old. He has never been to a museum of ocean science. He has never seen the deep water current acoustic research that his mother was conducting in the lighthouse on our property when she died. Julian set the whale down. But he knew, somehow from books in a library, from stories told to a wooden puppet on a miniature stage, in the dark, that the water had its own architecture, things that moved below the storm, structures you couldn't see from the surface. He looked at the room. I was commissioned to design a building, he said. I have designed buildings. I am good at it. I am. Some of you have been kind enough to suggest. Very good at it. He paused. For 17 years, I have been designing structures that protect things from the weather, structures that hold, structures that resist, fortresses. If I am being precise about it, which, professionally, I always am, he picked up the glowing lighthouse. This building should not be a fortress, he said. It should be a lighthouse. Not in the metaphorical sense, not as a design language or a thematic reference. A lighthouse in the functional sense. A place that is specifically useful to people who are trying to find their way in the dark. He set it down. Elena Vance, my wife, had been planning this building for 3 years before she died. She had a grant application, a partnership with the Marine Biology Department at Oregon State, and a vision for a program that would bring children from coastal communities into contact with the science of the water they live next to. Julian looked at the paper shapes on the podium. I found her plans 8 days ago. In the room I had been unable to enter for 7 years. The room was completely still. I am withdrawing my original design, Julian said. the technical proposal, the materials innovation, the critical path analysis. He paused. I am proposing instead that we build what Elena designed, the structure I will provide. The vision is hers. He reached into the canvas bag one more time. He placed Elena's original planning documents on the podium, not a copy. The originals. Slightly worn at the fold lines from years in a lighthouse box. She called it the Sound Museum, Julian said, because the research she was doing was about what the ocean sounds like below the surface. Below the storm. The things you can only hear when you stop making noise and hold very still. He looked at the room. 312 people. My son held very still for 7 years. Julian said. And then someone sat down next to him, and repaired old books, and talked to a wooden puppet, and opened a window 1 inch. And he heard something, and he spoke. He picked up Barnaby and looked at him for a moment. With the expression of a man acknowledging a debt, I am reliably informed that Barnaby was instrumental. A single laugh from somewhere in the left section of the room. Not derisive. The laugh of someone who had been holding something tightly and just let it go. Then another. Then Julian Vance, 17-year veteran of every major architectural stage in the country. 47 awards. Designer of 6 coastal cultural sites. Man who had not laughed in public since before his wife's memorial service laughed. It was not a performed laugh. It was the short, slightly surprised laugh of someone who has just noticed something genuinely funny about the position they're in, standing at a podium in a ballroom worth more per square foot than most buildings he designed. Holding a wooden puppet. Explaining the structural logic of emotional recovery to 300 people in evening wear. It was real. It was the second time in this story that Julian Vance laughed. And the first time anyone outside the Monolith had heard it. The room stood up. Not immediately. The way things that are true happen first. One person, then the movement spreading outward. Until 312 people were standing in a ballroom in Seattle, applauding a man who had brought a puppet to the most important professional moment of his career. Evelyn Marsh was in the 4th row. She had come as a board member. She had come with her 2 lawyers and her tablet, and the prepared statement about the foundation's concerns regarding the project management structure. She had come, as she always came, because she was right. She stood up with everyone else. She did not know, precisely, when she had stopped being right. Somewhere between the winged whale and the glowing lighthouse, somewhere between 7 years, 4 months, and 11 days, and the specific sound of Julian Vance laughing in public for the first time, she was still standing when Julian stepped away from the podium and walked through the applause, toward the exit. Barnaby back in the canvas bag. Elena's planning documents under his arm. He did not look at her as he passed. He did not need to. He and Leo drove through the Seattle rain in the direction of Portland. Leo, in the passenger seat with Barnaby on his knee. The highway dark and long and lit only by the forward motion of their own lights. Leo did not speak continuously. He was not, suddenly, a child without selective mutism. He was a child who had said 7 words in a storm and then, in the days since, added a few more careful words, chosen with the precision of someone who has learned that language is not infinite and should not be spent carelessly. He had said, asterisk, the bird is for Clara. He had said, about the lighthouse, asterisk, it sounds like when you put a shell to your ear. He had said, this evening, before they left. Asterisk, are we going to get her? Asterisk, Julian had said, yes. Now Leo looked out the passenger window at the rain-dark highway and held Barnaby in his lap and waited with the patience of a child who had learned to wait. Julian drove. Epilogue. The ledger's last entry. Arthur Greaves was 61 years old and had kept the household ledger of the Monolith for 11 years. He had recorded the date the boiler was last serviced. The morning the salt air first cracked the north-facing concrete. The afternoon young Leo stopped answering to his own name. The date the first sound came back. The date the lighthouse alarm ran for 30 seconds and went quiet. The night a man drove into a storm in the direction of the coast road with a set of old keys in his pocket. He had recorded all of it, without judgment, without sentiment, in the handwriting of someone who understood that the act of writing a losernaish thing down was not the same as understanding it, but that the record existed. And that was its own kind of fidelity. 6 months after Clara Finch drove her 15-year-old Subaru back up the coast road and parked it in the gravel beside the property and walked into the Monolith for the second and permanent time. Arthur opened the ledger to a new section. He had begun carrying it to different parts of the house, to the library, where the east window stood open at varying increments, now depending on the weather, and where the 1,931 coastal survey had been fully restored and refiled under Elena's system. and where Leo sometimes sat at the reading table doing his paper shapes while Clara worked. Close enough that their elbows occasionally touched, neither of them moving away, to the covered walkway, which was no longer sealed. The lighthouse door stood open on clear days. The equipment inside serviced and updated. The recording instruments running again at the frequencies Elena had calibrated. On the wall of the round room, beside Elena's navigational photographs, Leo's winged whale. Framed, beside it, on a small shelf. Barnaby, standing at attention, to the hallway, where the mason jar had been replaced by a sequence of things. Over the months, whatever was growing on the cliff slope changed weekly. The architectural model had moved permanently to the left. No one discussed this. To the front steps, where Arthur sat on clear mornings with his coffee and listened to the coast doing its work below. On a Saturday in May, he brought the ledger to the front steps. The property was not quiet. This was new. The lighthouse was open, and 3 children from the late Tillamook Coastal Program were inside with their teacher, looking at the ocean acoustics display Elena had designed and Julian had built, and Leo had labeled in his careful, precise handwriting. Their voices came through the open door in the particular frequency of children encountering something that surprises them. From the library window above, Clara's voice, reading something aloud to Leo, not to Barnaby. Not to the room, directly to Leo, who was listening with his chin on his hand, and the expression of someone who has decided this is the best use of the available time. From the garden path to the north, Julian's footsteps. Unhurried. Returning from the lighthouse where he had been helping the teacher set up the sound equipment, he was carrying something. Arthur could see it from the steps. A mug. Not his own mug. Clara's mug. The one with the chipped handle she had brought from Portland in the canvas bag 6 months ago, which had ended up in the kitchen cabinet, and stayed there. He had brought her tea without being asked. He was carrying someone else's mug. Arthur watched him stop at the base of the steps and look up at the library window, where Clara's voice was still coming through. He watched Julian's face. Just for a moment, the unguarded version of it. The face a person makes when they are looking at something they did not know they are going to have and have not yet figured out how to hold without being afraid of dropping it. Then Julian saw Arthur watching. He sat down on the steps. He handed Arthur his own coffee mug, which he had also apparently collected from somewhere on the walk back. They sat on the steps together in the May morning. The lighthouse voices and the library voice and the Pacific below making its argument, and Arthur thought about the 11 years he had kept this to ledger, and what it had contained and what it contained now, which was a different thing entirely. He opened it to the last page. He wrote 4 sentences, because some endings required more than 2 words. Asterisk. The man laughed. The child called out into the storm. The ship found its harbor, and the lighthouse which had been keeping everything safe in the dark for 7 years. 4 months. And 11 days opened its door, and let the children in. He closed the ledger. He did not open a new one. Some records, when they are complete, should be allowed to be complete. The sea thrift on the cliff slope was blooming not because the story permitted it, but because it was May, and that was what sea thrift did in May on the Oregon coast. Indifferent to everything. Reliable as tide. Bright as anything. Asterisk. What is the thing you've been keeping safe in the dark, and what would it mean to open the door and let the light in? Asterisk. Leave one word. Just one. The word that lives in that question for you. And if this story has kept you company, if the monolith felt, at any point, like a house you've stood outside of, then you already know, the door was never locked from the outside. It never is. Stay close. The next story begins, where this one breathes,